Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be showing you how I painted this beautiful Irish mountains scene. I really enjoyed emphasising the green of Ireland, which I think is such a distinctive feature of its incredibly unique landscape. It's always so rich and so verdant and incredibly beautiful. So let's get started with this painting. I'm using a limited palette and I'm using this photograph here for inspiration. As you can see, I haven't painted it exactly. It's my interpretation, as always. I always like to be inspired by photographs, and please note, I'm not very good at painting sheep, so I have left them out. Maybe one day I'll master the art of painting animals, but not yet. So, as always, I'm beginning with a quick sketch, getting the mountains in the right place and getting the shores of the lake where I want them, and just a few marks where I want to sort of paint the suggestion of shrubs, grasses and plants in the foreground. I'm using Saunders Waterford rough paper. My board's at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees, so gravity will help with the painting. And I shall start off by painting the sky and the mountains wet in wet. So wetting the sky mostly all over, leaving a few dry patches for some harder edged clouds, using my 1.5 inch Mottler brush. I'm using a fairly limited palette, a few more than I sometimes do. So I'll be starting the sky off with raw sienna and then going in to create the greyer clouds with Payne's grey. And then I shall use raw umber, burnt sienna, a bit of ultramarine blue, some sap green, maybe a bit of alizarin crimson to complete the scene. But firstly, painting in a nice atmospheric sort of stormy sky over these beautiful verdant mountains. You can paint this kind of sky with any large wash brush that you're familiar with and comfortable using. I like this Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler, but it's not necessary for painting this sky. You could paint with a large mop, a harky brush, any kind of brush that you like, larger the better, and just familiarise yourself with its water holding capacity so that you don't flood your painting. And the more you practice, the more you'll find the kind of brushes that you like the shape of best, that suits you individually for these large washes. You can see I've brought the Payne's grey over the mountains and that will start them off. But this closer mountain, I want to get some green into that in the underpainting, and because of the transparent nature of watercolour, this will help my colours to be really rich and bright when I paint deeper values over the mountains in the second stage of this painting. So it's a bit of raw umber in there as well, just to warm up that green in places. Then just introducing a little bit of green, just a very light value of green in the far distance where the sunlight is catching the mountain on the right. And then a clean damp brush, a small mop brush, and I'm just going to soften back that little bit of cloud there. Just soften it back so that the transitions there are a little smoother. And this is Payne's grey with a touch of ultramarine, just to make a sort of bluish grey. Horizontal brush strokes and just quickly fill in the lake, keeping it nice and plain. Maybe a little bit of darker Payne's grey into the mountain. Note the direction of my brush strokes. I'm following the direction of the mountain slope. And then using my palette knife, I'm going to scrape a little bit of texture, not too much, a little bit of texture through that paint. All this will be hidden because the mountains need to be a lot darker and a lot richer, but because of the transparent nature of watercolour, this underpainting will show through a little in the finished painting and add some nice variety to this closer mountain. And now painting onto the dry paper, so using the wet on dry technique and putting some nice rich greens across the foreground for these kind of tumbled grasses and plants on this nearer bank. Dipping into sap green, raw sienna, maybe a bit of burnt sienna and raw umber. Trying to get a little bit of dry brush here and there, so I'm changing up the textures, the brush strokes and the directionality here to suggest these plants in the foreground without overtly painting them. Making sure I get some mid values and maybe some slightly darker values in. And so now that the foreground is painted, I've created a wet in wet environment. So the colours are now beginning to marry and mingle and sort of wet blend on the page. This is a clean damp flat brush, and I'm just going to lift out just a very faint waterline underneath each mountain. And then finally using the palette knife to scrape a little bit of texture through that rich paint in the foreground to suggest the tangle of grasses and plants. We can also use the directionality of these little marks to lead the eye across the water to the mountains. And that's my underpainting just about done. So I need to go and have a cup of coffee, leave it for an hour or so and make sure it's completely dry, and then come back and continue with the painting wet onto dry. So here's the dry painting. I'm going to start with the central mountain. That's a sort of fairly dark tone, but it's not quite as dark a value as the foreground mountain. So I'm going to try and get this right first, and then I can judge the values that I need for the foreground mountain in order to make everything else balanced and stand out. This is a mixture of green, my sap green, and it's been mixed with a bit of ultramarine blue, some raw sienna, a bit of burnt sienna as well, and we'll have little touches excuse me, of Payne's grey. So this is a mid to dark value and quite a desaturated colour, so this hopefully will just keep it light and green and vibrant, but push it back a little so that we get a sense of depth and distance. The brush I'm using here is a size 14 Escoda Perla synthetic round brush, and I really like it for painting these kinds of parts of the painting, like the wet on dry. and you can see I'm adding in a little bit of value into the foreground, painting between my scraped out marks to add some darks, which will give me some depth and shadows in my foreground. Any medium to large size round brush will do the job for you as long as it's got a good point. I've now added a touch more water to this dark mix just to lighten the value a little and to cool it down a little bit. I'm just painting in the shadow part of this distant mountain. The top will be a sort of brighter green eventually that I'll glaze over this underpainting so that it really does look like sun hitting the grass. Now that most of the distant mountains have been painted in, I can judge the value and the intensity of colour that I need for this foreground mountain. So I've got the same mix, but I've darkened it with a bit more ultramarine blue and a bit more Payne's grey. Still keeping it green, but I want it a nice, rich, varied green, so that the layer underneath will sort of shine through. This mountain is in shadow, and that's what I want to get across in the painting. So just flattening out where the mountain meets the lake. And I hope you can see that this darker, richer value for the closest mountain now pushes the mid-ground mountain back and we've got even more depth and distance showing with the very far distant mountains. Now the last thing to do is to increase the value, and I've added a touch of Windsor yellow to my green here. This is to try and get the effect of the sunlight hitting that verdant grass in the distance. Now that might be a little bit bright. I think I might have preferred it the way it was before, but I'm not going to lose sleep over that. It's one of those things, as we paint, we make a decision, especially with watercolour painting. We have to make quick decisions, and sometimes our decisions aren't quite right. But we learn from this. This is how we learn, progress, and then move forward. This is just a lining brush, a reservoir liner, and I'm going to just put a few thin dark marks, crisper marks, harder edged little marks over that suggested plant detail in the foreground, just to bring a few sort of flowers and grasses over the lake, and that just adds a little bit more interest to the foreground and leads the eye into the painting. And I think that's just about finished. I'll remove the tape. That removes all the messy paint marks on the tape and gives us a clean white edge, almost as if it was framed or mounted in a mat. And so we can see whether or not we need to do anything else to it. And I'm quite happy with this for a loose painting. I think it works quite nicely. I think the values work well from foreground mountains all the way through to the back. I think I could lighten up that distant mountain a little bit more. I think it's a bit bright, but that's just one of those things. I shall learn from that and pay more attention to that in my in my next painting. But I'm really pleased overall with the atmosphere and that beautiful verdant green that's so distinctive of the wonderful Irish landscapes. So I hope you enjoyed that and found it helpful. Please give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thank you so much to everyone that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.